This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode, I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 28 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Today we're talking about getting from A to B. It's one of the trickier things when we travel, especially if there are language issues or you're travelling in a country where you can't read the script. And sometimes simply, I can even get lost in my own country, I must admit. In fact, I had a little bit of I didn't exactly get lost, but I had a problem with getting from A to B just this week. I was spending some time up in the Coral Coast of Western Australia for work, and the instructions that I'd been given included travel from pick up your hire car at the airport and travel from here to here, A to B, using your GPS. So I hopped in the hire car and there was no GPS. So I thought, okay. And I was out in a fairly remote part of Western Australia, and I certainly didn't have any mobile signal for my phone, so I couldn't ask Siri or use my own GPS. So I hopped back out because the lady from the hire car company was still waiting nearby while other customers picked up their cars. And I said, so they told me there'd be a GPS and there isn't. And she laughed at me and said, we don't have GPS up here. And explained that, there's really only one road and there's no sort of signal anyway. GPS just isn't a thing. I thought, okay. So I asked her directions to get to the first destination I needed, and I continued to do that for the rest of the trip. And I renamed GPS General Person on the Street, GPS. And I thought, that's actually the way we used to do it before all of this technology came in, and it actually made getting from A to B quite a lot more fun. And to be fair, it was in a fairly simple place where you might travel along one long road for 50 kilometres and then turn right. If I was in the middle of a city, I think I'd be a bit more annoyed by a lack of technology these days. But it worked out and it was kind of fun. I just did have a moment of sort of mini stress when they said, there's no GPS. And I knew all through my itinerary there was so many mentions of using it. But it all worked out. And apart from occasionally taking the wrong direction but realising fairly soon that I was doing it, I didn't really get lost. And so it all worked out. Thank you to the general person on the street who I asked many times my different version of GPS this week. Now, I've got three guests today talking about various issues they've had while getting from A to B on their travels. And the first guest today is Stephen Henson from Journeys with Stephen. He has a couple of stories to tell about finding his way around in Germany and in China. He spent a lot of time in China, so that's particularly interesting. And there seems to have been a few language issues for Stephen when he's trying to get around.
Because I took German in high school, 4 years, so you would think I would know some German, and I felt pretty proud of myself about that. And we were in Germany one time, had rented a car and was driving through the countryside trying to get to our hotel, got hopelessly lost, spotted a local and said to my wife, hey, no problem. I know German. I will ask this guy, say, hey, I'm lost. Where are we? I need to get to this hotel. Can you tell me how to get there? I said all that. My German was so good that he answered me. And he talked for 5 minutes about on explaining the way apparently to get to the hotel. However, I understood not a word that he said.
This is a big problem. It's all very well to be able to say something, but if you sound too good, you'll get a big spiel back and have no idea what's going on. That's happened to me a few times too. It's quite unfortunate.
Yeah, the conversational pace is the one thing I've never sort of mastered. And when you're lost, it really makes it especially difficult. Many of my other lost times, though, occur in China. And again, it goes back to pretty much not knowing the language, so not being able to read signs and not being able to really ask people.
I
And
bet.
and there, especially in Beijing and in many other cities in China too, things are growing so rapidly that road names keep changing, and places that used to exist don't exist anymore. I remember getting in a taxi not too long ago. I wanted to try this actually American barbecue place. I had this craving for American food. Got in the taxi, gave the name of the place to the taxi driver. He nodded and we took off, which they always do because the culture there is not to admit that you don't know what you're doing. He only later said he had no idea where we were going. But that's okay because I had a little app and I could even show him the name of the place in Chinese characters and where it was at and so on. And we just kept driving and driving and driving. Well, as it turns out, even since that app had been produced, they had changed many roads, the names of them. Some ended abruptly and started again a block later. And, the two of us got hopelessly lost. And, so that happens in China a lot.
I remember when I lived in Japan that finding addresses was a big problem because they didn't have a very standardized system, and it wasn't a number on a street. It was like a part of a grid, and it was impossible to use any kind of logic to figure out where an address was. So that did make for some challenging moments. And I can imagine in China, with all its rapid development, that's far, far more difficult.
Yeah, and again, like a taxi driver, they don't use maps. If they get lost, they get on their cell phone and they call a buddy and ask him if he knows where they might be headed to. Or I have a story where one time I was going to a bar, but it was like at 7:00 in the morning because what I was doing, I was meeting up with a bunch of Americans and we were going to watch an American football game. We're all alumni of Michigan State and our team was playing in the U.S., but of course that was 7 a.m. in China. I get in a taxi and I tell him to take me to this bar, and I don't think he expected to have a customer go to a bar at 7 a.m. So, I mean, he drove me all over the place. Is this it? No. Is this it? Is this it? Finally, we stopped at a hotel, and I walked in and asked the people at the reception there where this bar was. And they had no idea. And finally, I just said, okay, I'll just start walking around and looking for it myself. Well, it turns out it was like a half a block away from this hotel. But they still had no idea that the place was there.
It definitely is true that it can be hard to get around anywhere new, but it's especially the case in countries where you can't read the language, just like Stephen's issues in China. I remember when I first travelled to Russia that some very clever person advised me to learn the Cyrillic alphabet, which I did diligently, and it really helped that I could read the street signs. Cyrillic was particularly confusing because, half of the letters look like our alphabet, but they're different. And then some look a little bit different and similar, and there's backwards N's and H's, which are really N's, and all kinds of tricky things. But it was worth reading it so that... learning to read it so that I could identify locations and help get from A to B using that new knowledge. I've forgotten most of it now, unfortunately, but at least at the time I managed to master that alphabet enough. When I lived in Japan, I remember at first that the kanji, the Japanese characters, seemed absolutely impossible to even ever learn. And I lived in a relatively country area part of Osaka in my second year in Japan, where they often didn't have the romaji, our translations of place names on signs, and it became much more important to know some of those characters. But once again, I've forgotten most of them now. Isn't language a terrible thing? It's so easy to forget. But at the time, I had managed to know a lot of the important ones, and it certainly helped me get around a lot easier. So, speaking of getting around, Craig and Linda from the Indie Travel Podcast are my next guests, and they have had some issues with getting around through Scotland and other places by the sounds of it, but especially when they go hiking, they have had some issues of correctly getting from A to B. I'll let Craig and Linda tell you the story.
Well, we don't often actually get lost because of the wonders of modern technology. We have Google Maps and various other mapping software. Sometimes we come out of a subway station and turn left instead of right, but it's not too bad. The worst time we've ever got lost, though, is when we've been hiking. So we've done a couple of Caminos to Santiago and we've got spectacularly lost. But my favourite story is when we were doing the West Highland Way. Actually, it's not my favourite story. I think it's Craig's favourite story because it puts me in a ridiculously bad light.
I'm looking forward to hearing this.
Yeah, well, it was it's kind of a 5 to 7 day hike, depending on how fast you go. And we were quite, we didn't have much money at the time, so we decided to take our tent, go slowly, have these enormous backpacks, and camp along the way. So we decided to do it over 7 days. And as we walked, we met some people. We met a lovely German couple. We walked with them for a while. It was wonderful. And we ended up staying in the same campsites for a couple of nights, and we decided to walk together. And at one point, we were walking along, and we came across a little bridge, and then there were arrows pointing the way, directing you in which way to go. And I saw an arrow pointing straight. Since I was at the front of the group, I led everyone straight ahead up quite a steep hill. And we thought this was a little bit strange because we'd been told that the West Highland Way was relatively flat, not a lot of hills. So we were struggling our way up the hill, struggling.
Now we're talking about a significant angle here, the kind of angle that means you're using your hands to help you pull your way up over scree without a path.
Yeah.
Okay, not just a little slope.
Linda kept on pushing us up.
Oh, it was kind of an agreement. At one point we stopped and we said, but do you think this is the way? We'd seen the arrow. We'd all seen the arrow. So we kept on going. Eventually, when we were about a third of the way up this really significant hill, there were a couple of guys coming down. And they said, where are you going? And we said, we're on the West Highland Way. And they said, no. The West Highland Way is way down there alongside the river on that nice flat ground where you don't have to climb a hill. And it turned out that it was one of the Monroes, which are these hills that are all over a certain height, and it's like a national sport to go Monroe bagging and climb all of these hills. And we climbed up a third of it. It was, wow, it was spectacular.
And was everyone in the group really angry at you, Linda?
I think I was the angriest at me, but everyone did make some snide comments about it. And, this was 7 or 8 years ago, and Craig is still making snide comments about it. So,
everything has its upside as well. So even though we climbed for probably about 45 minutes up a steep slope in scree, an ankle was sprained, mini rock slides around us. By the time we got down to the bottom, we decided that we really did need to stop for lunch in the little village at the bottom of the mountain, and we had one of the best meals we've probably ever had in Scotland.
That's true. And we're still friends.
There's a silver lining. Yeah, we're still friends with those people. Friendship through adversity.
Yeah, I think that was actually a major factor in forming our friendship.
Yeah, it was probably a big bonding moment, so...
I think so.
I don't think anyone's going to forget it anytime soon.
Yeah, they live in Berlin, so we see them when we're in Berlin, which is maybe every 2 or 3 years. And yes, every time we meet up, some comment is made about that walk. So.
And they don't suggest going hiking again?
They do actually. We met up with them the next year, and we went hiking in the mountains in Meschede in Germany. And it was brilliant. It was freezing. There was snow. It was between Christmas and New Year's.
Beautiful.
And I wasn't in the lead, so we didn't get lost.
I was suspecting they wouldn't let you lead anymore at the very least. Oh, but that sounds
I've lost my crown.
Yes, I'm afraid so. But as always, those kind of situations normally end up to be better stories. If you'd just done the hike and followed the correct arrows, it would kind of be a lot less memorable, wouldn't it?
That's true. Although we do have another fun story about the West Highland Way, because Craig had these Vibram 5-finger shoes. I don't know if you know them. They're like barefoot shoes.
So they've got 5 toes, kind of.
They've got 5 toes, right? So he was wearing those for a lot of the hike. And I remember we stopped in a pub one day and we were sitting there eating our lunch, and I overheard some other hikers going, "Oh my goodness, have you seen the footprints? Bigfoot is on this walk. Oh my God."
Oh, that's brilliant.
And so we created this legend. There was this myth of Bigfoot walking the West Highland Way, the fresh footprints in the mud by the stiles.
Yeah, I started intentionally walking through areas of mud and walking over some flat rocks and things like that, just to leave some extra footprints and keep people talking.
It was hilarious.
Oh, there's people all around the world talking about those footprints, probably still today.
Very likely, yeah.
I wish I'd been there to follow the footsteps of Bigfoot out in the West Highland Way. It sounds like Craig had a lot of fun creating a bit of a myth of that five-toed monster out there. And as it is often the case, it sounds like this tale of getting lost turned out absolutely fine and into a very memorable story that they still all tell each other 7 or 8 years on. I'm not sure that I would have been particularly forgiving, I must say, when it involves walking up a steep hill. I guess it wasn't exactly hot weather in Scotland, but I love to walk and hike, but I don't like to do too much more than is necessary. Perhaps I'm a tad lazy, but it reminded me of a time when I was in Japan. In fact, it was the very day after I'd arrived in Japan, and I was with my boyfriend of the time. We'd come to Japan to teach English in July, so the middle of the Japanese summer coming out of Australian winter. And we had 2 or 3 days free before our training began to work as teachers, and we really wanted to make the most of it. That's kind of me to a fault. I always want to make the most of that time before things get into normality again. And so we were somewhat exhausted. We'd flown over a night flight, so we'd completely missed a night of sleep. And it was really hot and really humid in Japan, but we wanted to discover it. So we had taken the train out to Nara, beautiful part of Japan, and started to have a good look around. Nara Park is there. There's lots of other sort of parkland areas and temples and lots of places you can walk to. But there was a few issues with us, getting from A to B. We didn't have a very good map. We couldn't understand any of the signs that didn't have English on them. And we were increasingly hot and bothered. And I remember trying even just to figure out how to buy a drink. And that was tricky because I couldn't figure out what the drinks were. And a lot of the sort of soft drinks and cool drinks in Japan are a little bit unusual. You get used to them, but at first they were like, I remember buying one and thinking, oh my goodness, what is this weird sweet and salty taste? This is not helping me. I can't drink it. And unfortunately, in our attempt to get back to the train station, which I think was not in the same direction that we were walking, we ended up going up and down some particularly steep hills. And by the end of it, I was sitting at the bottom of the hill. We finally found some shade. And I think it's the closest I've ever been to having heat stroke. I was starting to sort of say crazy things and I didn't really know where we were and felt very dizzy and weird. And I was not really happy with our inability to get easily from A to B. But I think I managed to find something better to drink and we took it easy and got home and had a really good night's sleep. And by the next day, I felt okay. And over the next couple of years, of course, I made much better friends with Japan and the Japanese language, and I could find my way around a lot better. And I also respected their rather sticky hot summer much more. So all worked out as it always does. Now, my final guest today is Jean from the Traveling Honeybird. Now, she's had some issues with getting around using transport and taxis that she's going to tell us about today.
I think taking taxis in Myanmar was also something that petrified me. Due to the water festival, we had to take a lot of private taxis. And because these people are being paid only one way to drop you off, and it's a 6 or a 7 hour drive sometimes between the cities, they take the fastest route, which generally does mean it's a local road. So roads where buses can't physically fit on. So you're on little windy roads going through and over mountains, and people are just beeping at each other as they go around blind corners. I think taking local transport can just be terrifying at the time because you don't know what's going to happen and you don't know where you are and you don't know what to do if something goes wrong. You're at the mercy of a driver who may or may not speak any English.
Yes, I've had those kind of experiences, and you really, there's not much you can do except just sort of hold on for dear life and hope that you get there.
Yeah, you got to go, I've paid you a reasonable amount of money, and I'm hoping that amount of money has been enough for you to get me where I need to go safely.
Yes. Well, you have to hope that they don't have their own death wish, and they would also like to arrive safely. So, but they do have, in some places, different considerably different safety standards to what we would expect here.
The lack of seatbelts tends to get me.
Yeah. Yes, me too.
Or you hop in a car or a bus and like the seatbelt strap is there, but the connector into the seat is not. That's a big one I found in Asia.
It's a bit freaky, isn't it?
Yeah, not my cup of tea.
It's not my cup of tea either, because I'm used to feeling that lovely safety net of a seatbelt. Yes, and perhaps the somewhat lawless nature of driving in those places where speed is really no issue, road quality is somewhat different, and yeah. I remember when I was younger, so before I had a son, and I would be in those kind of situations, and I would kind of just close my eyes and hope for the best and think, oh, well, if something happens to me now, at least I died doing something I really love doing. And that was like the way I would console myself. But I'm a lot more cautious and averse to those kind of risks now that I've got a son, because I wouldn't want him to be left without me or something to happen to him. I think we've probably all had these kind of encounters when we travel with driving standards that perhaps don't match our own standards, or even things like bus rides along mountainous roads where the road just drops away just, immediately to the side of your bus, for example. And I do tend to get pretty nervous in those situations. There's no two ways about it. And my most common strategy is simply to close my eyes and pretend I'm not there. It's just something that has to be done sometimes to get from A to B. And, without it, then what am I going to do? Not see the world? It's not worth it. So I will just keep closing my eyes, I think, and making the most of a situation. But as I said, I definitely am a bit more aware about those kinds of risks now that I take my young boy along with me. But we will still get to see the world somehow. Okay, so that is the end of our episode on getting from A to B. I'd love to hear your stories from your travels when you've been trying to get places. I think everyone has a getting around story that's one they tell, whether it's because they've got lost or because they were terrified or because of what they saw on the way, or perhaps who you rode with, the kind of tales perhaps of Southeast Asia where you're on a bus with chickens and who knows what other kind of animals as well. So do let me know. You can reach me on Twitter at Amanda Kendall. You can use the hashtag ThoughtfulTravelPod. And you can also look me up on Facebook. Just search for Not a Ballerina and you'll find me there. A huge thank you as always to my great guests and their fascinating stories. First up we had Stephen Henson from journeyswithstephen.com. That's Stephen with a PH. So thanks to Stephen. He always has good stories to tell. After Stephen, I chatted with Craig and Linda Martin from the Indie Travel Podcast. So you can look them up at indietravelpodcast.com or search for them in iTunes. They also run a great business for people who have a blog or a website called The Performance Foundry. So you can look for them at performancefoundry.com. And finally, I chatted again with my lovely Aussie friend Jean from Traveling Honeybird. So you can find her at travelinghoneybird.com. And of course, all of these details and more will be in the show notes. And for this episode, you can find them at notaballerina.com/28. If you have a chance to pop into iTunes and leave a rating or a review, I will love you forever. And don't forget, I would love to hear your tales of getting from A to B, be they scary or funny or otherwise. Thanks so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.
Jackrabbit FM for your ears.
Who is that? Hi, podcast.